Hello again. Now then, where was I? Oh, yes, the hospital. There was a policewoman in the ward, apparently, for my protection. Very odd. And then my gardener arrived. He had brought me a few items, like a fresh designer bag by the Italian designer, Urini Medica, and a few other items that a lady of my age really should not be without. Unusually thoughtful. Then he began to ramble on about some cuckoos and gangs and drugs. Good Lord, I thought. He's clearly had too much of the grape this season. He told me that he had called the police after seeing several cars driving past the gatehouse cottage where he resides on my estate, and he'd become quite concerned when one incumbent asked for directions. Suddenly, my dream started to make more sense. I was soon told that I could go home, but not to leave my estate. I was advised to get legal advice and told by the police that I may be hearing from them. It was all very strange. I informed Henry Fawsley, QC, now Casey, who seemed irritated by the fact that since Jug-Ears III had been crowned, it had to spend a small fortune on new signage and stationery headers. After relating my carolus story, he said he would make inquiries and get back to me. A few hours later, he arrived in person at my house and rather nervously informed me, oh dear, that I was to be charged with conspiracy to supply Class A drugs to minors, oh dear, and that I could be looking at 3 to 5 years in prison, oh dear. That set me off. I couldn't help myself. 3 to 5 years. Henry, I said, I never know if I have the next 3 to 5 minutes. Dear, oh dear. Henry looked rather worried and said I should take it seriously. Oh no, not at my age, Henry, I said, never. It was a good job that I was wearing my tenor ladies. Or he would have clearly noticed that I'd laughed so hard. I just had an accident. Oh dear. Oh, I was to appear in court in 3 weeks' time. I was rather looking forward to it, as Degsy and the boys would also be there. The allotted day came along, and I arrived in court. I was escorted in and made to sit alongside Degsy and the boys. I have to say, without their hats and scarves on, there were no oil paintings. There was no sign of Tina. Hello, boys, I said. Do not speak to the defendant. The lady judge said. Oh, I said, I'm merely getting reacquainted, Your Honour. There were chuckles from the public gallery. Silence in court, she barked. Oh dear, I thought. She's a salty one. I better keep stum. Henry Fawsley Casey stepped forward confidently and set out his case. He said he would clearly prove that I was a victim of a premeditated plot by Degsy and the boys to break into my house and take it over for an undetermined period where I was to be held hostage and forced to supply drugs to the public, and how, if it wasn't for my observant and courageous gardener, they would have got away with it. I didn't recognise the scenario at all, but I believed him. He was remarkably convincing. Marvellous. I suppose that's why it cost so much to hire. Utterly brilliant. And then it was the turn of the boy's solicitor, who seemed to be completely out of his depth. He came forward with a very sad tale of poor education and no parental input, and how as children, Degsy and the boys were left to fend for themselves. Poor choices made in an area of low-income jobs, paying only on average £9.50 to £10.50 an hour. Good Lord, I thought, I pay my gardener nearly twice that amount. I have to admit, I was feeling somewhat empathic towards the boys by now. Suddenly, Henry Fawsley stood up and said he had a vital witness to call via video link. A large screen TV was brought into the court, and who should appear on it but Tina? She was in a room nearby to the court, in the presence of a police protection officer. She had clearly gained some weight and was dressed rather smartly. She confessed to everything and told the court how Degsy had got her hooked on drugs and how the boys and Degsy never ever took them. She said that their arrival at my estate was all Degsy's plan, but the boys were all in on it. She said she wanted to apologise to me and that she intended, with the court's grace, to start a new life in another part of the country and was determined to deal with her addiction. I jumped up and shouted, "Good for you, dear! Well done!" "Silence!" the salty judge says. "You'll be fined for contempt of court if you speak out again." I couldn't help it. I was so inspired by Tina's courage. Henry Fawsley looked across rather nervously. I could see he was sweating. Good, I thought. I like to think he earns his fee. You see, I could relate to the whole scenario. Really, we all have black sheep in our families and people who have made bad choices in their lives. Our family's black sheep was Uncle Aubrey. He broke Granny's heart when he ran off to join the Foreign Legion in the 60s. Once the romance of the A.I.A had turned into the gruelling reality, he did another runner and ended up in the French port of Marseille and became embroiled with some very nasty individuals. They were a Corsican mafia drug gang. Aubrey had a passion for chemistry, discovered after Grandpa brought him a small set for Christmas as a child, and it seems his skills in that department were in demand, and he was paid handsomely for them. Unfortunately, Audrey decided to get a little greedy after a particularly large consignment of powders was made, around 600 kilos. He then demanded a bigger cut from these undesirables. After he had been cremated, his ashes were mixed in with a large batch of powders going via the Suez Canal to the west coast of the USA, California to be precise. The rest was sent via London to be distributed to the European market. Unbeknown to us all, Aubrey had now gone global. By now, he'd been imbibed by several Hollywood stars and starlets. Thousands of youngsters in and around London and a few quite well-known artistes had shoved him up their noses. He had a very detrimental effect on two quite well-known artists of the times, barely a month apart. And Miss Janis Joplin and Mr. James Hendricks. I was deeply saddened at the time to hear of Miss Joplin's demise, and I felt compelled to listen to her last album. Well, for as long as I could bear it. It was too emotional. Aubrey had obviously affected her voice quite badly. The vibrato was all over the place. The kindest thing I think I could say is that it was not good, but my God, it was loud. people. That was enough. As for Mr. Hendricks, it's difficult to say, really, as he was only an occasional user of heroin and its derivatives. But I had heard, and this is strictly entre nous, that he had shoved quite an amount of Aubrey up his nose in the fateful week before, the day he imbibed enough pills to put a water buffalo to sleep for a month. His playing skills didn't really improve beyond that point, which is a shame, because I heard they were exceptional. But then, so was his drug taking. So sad. Granny missed Aubrey until the very end. You see, Degsy, the boys and I have a lot in common, really. What we didn't have in common, however, was decent legal representation in court, and as such, I am now free to live at my leisure on my estate, whereas Degsy and the boys are now living at the pleasure of His Majesty Juggius III for the next 7 years, somewhere in the middle of Birmingham. As if just going to Birmingham wasn't punishment enough. Oh dear. Did I mention I'm 102?